Since you're talking about the East, would you also consider Southeast Asia, the enormous changes in Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia, and what effects this will have in the larger picture?
Yeah, and I should say that although, as I said, I apologize, the talk was very China focused, there are chapters on Southeast Asia, Japan, India, etc., because I do think that it's a big mistake to see this as a bilateral struggle between the US and China. Who, inverted commas, wins will depend on basically on how the other powers respond economically and politically. And Southeast Asia's a really interesting swing area, if you like. I mean, firstly, it's an illustration of the optimistic side of Easternization, because if you think in the 60s and right into the mid-70s, was an area of sort of horrific war, Vietnam War, Cambodia, etc. Then when they managed to restore peace, it's been a synonym for booming, successful economics, and even some quite hopeful political transitions in Indonesia, the end of the Suharto dictatorship relatively peacefully, and a transition to democracy. So this is a part of the world that's done well by the current dispensation. That I think there is now a sort of palpable nervousness that as China's sort of Middle Kingdom ambitions become more evident, how do they respond? They're right in the center of having to scratch their heads about, well, where do we place our bets? You know, what are our economic interests? What are our strategic interests? Do we still look to the United States? Or can we rely on that? And I think that most of these countries, not all of them, would prefer a strong American presence in the region because it protects them from being ordered around by the Chinese. But they are doubtful that they can necessarily bank on that. And the ones that are sticking up for it are increasingly being put under pressure by the Chinese. It's been very interesting to see what's happened to Singapore, which hugely successful place, obviously, one knows, and a very rare example of a country that I think genuinely has a special relationship with the US and China. They played that extremely well, so that they were initial sort of hailers and sponsors of the rise of China, trained a lot of Chinese officials. Lee Kuan Yew was a big cheerleader for China, but they retained the security relationship with the US, the Navy docks there, and American companies used Singapore as a base. And for a long time, that was a successful strategy. But it's slightly coming under strain now, because when the Singaporeans endorsed, there was a court case which knocked back China's claims on the South China Sea, and when the Singaporeans said that was a good thing, their ambassador was called in Beijing. Suddenly they found that some weaponry that they were transporting through Hong Kong for military exercises got seized and impounded. And the Chinese are really sort of putting the heat on them. And it's surprising, because they've been such good friends of China. But it's part of a pattern. And I think that, you can't be too definitive about this, because countries go backwards and forwards depending on their own internal politics, where they position themselves. So 2 or 3 years ago, you would have said South Korea, which is not Southeast Asia, but was tilting towards China very clearly. But then things change. There's Park Geun-hye gets into trouble. And the South Koreans now have a pretty bad relationship with China. So none of these shifts are definitive. But at the moment, there's definitely a series of Southeast Asian countries that seem to be moving more in Beijing's direction. Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, partly because their own internal politics have become less democratic, and therefore they come under pressure from the US, and therefore they look to Beijing for protection, but also because of the weight of these economic ties I've described, the hope of Chinese investment, the threat of Chinese retaliation. That also weighs. And the most significant is the Philippines, which is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's one of the major disputer of China's claims in the South China Sea. Secondly, because it's always had a close military relationship with the US, albeit post-Marcos that changes a bit. But the Philippines done this incredible tilt, where Duterte, the new president, suddenly went on a sort of anti-American rampage, went to Beijing, said, I'm announcing a separation from the United States. China is the new power in the region. We're all going to have to adapt to that. Now, again, word of caution, he's obviously slightly crazy, so it's not clear that this will persist. And also the Chinese have not rewarded them by dialing back the pressure on the Philippines in the territorial dispute, so they're concerned about that. But for the moment, it was quite a striking example, I think, of how things are tilting China's way in that region.